All right, hello there, AP World people. Let's learn all about the strategies of the 5 big European maritime empires. If you got the boats, take over the world. That's what it's up today. All right, let's do it. So, start off with Portugal. Portugal was the first European country to get into the ocean traveling game with their whole Prince Henry the Navigator I talked about in the last video. And Portugal really got their advantage by sending this explorer to the southern part of Africa, because for almost all of human history, Europeans thought Africa just went south forever. But Vasco da Gama famously discovered there was a way under Africa so you could get into the Indian Ocean. And once you're in the Indian Ocean, you can just skip over all those gunpowder empires and head straight to China. And it's basically impossible, even today, to get in a boat and without stopping get all the way to China. You've got to have some spots where you can re-up on food and repair your ship and things like that. So the Portuguese did this concept called a trading post empire, where they found little islands and made these kind of little cities around Africa and India and parts of Southeast Asia. And from these little trading posts, there were these kind of great little pit stops. You could think of them sort of like gas stations for your boats. I mean, you're not loading them up with gas, but you got to take a break every once in a while. And these trading posts allowed them to have not only some trading influence in these parts of Africa and India, but their bigger purpose was to be these layovers on their way to China, where they could make the big money. And so that was really Portugal's focus. They really did put so much more focus into the Indian Ocean than most other European powers of this time. They also did, of course, take over Brazil. I mean, it's definitely a really big, popular country today. But Brazil was their kind of secondary focus that will only sort of pay out later in human history. And the way I would really want you to think about the Portuguese in this period is they wanted to make themselves kind of like the Amazon.com of the 1500s to 1700s. They wanted it so that their influence was so spread out over the world, they could get products from anywhere and bring them back to Europe really efficiently by having their ships stop over at all these little trading post cities. Another thing I'll definitely add in here is that the Portuguese were the people who started the slave trade, and I'll deep dive into the slave trade later in this unit. And actually more than... I don't know if I can say more than half, but the majority of slaves that came to the New World came on Portuguese ships. So, rude, Portugal, rude. All right, moving on. All right, let's talk about Spain. So, Spain had a totally opposite strategy from Portugal. While Portugal was mostly focused on the Indian Ocean and really trying to connect all over the world, Spain really wanted to capitalize on their gains in the New World. And especially in Mexico and South America, they found all these great gold mines and silver mines. So they just said, okay, we're going to turn the whole world, this New World, into a giant money grab. And they also did recognize that the real way to make money is to trade with China. So they took over the Philippines, and from the Philippines, that's where they kind of did a lot of their deals with China. But Spain ignored the Indian Ocean entirely. The strategy for Spain to trade with China was to sail to Mexico to get goods, and then build ships on the other side of Mexico in modern-day Acapulco, and from Acapulco sail across the Pacific Ocean, go to the Philippines, and via the Philippines trade with China. So they went the Pacific Ocean strategy, while Portugal went the Indian Ocean strategy. And as you can see here, Spain took over just so much land. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to hold on to everything, and they're going to overextend themselves. And that's obviously going to be apparent later in history when all this part of planet Earth becomes independent from Spain. But yeah, their strategy was definitely ignore the Indian Ocean. Ain't nobody got time for that. All right. And yeah, the Manila Galleons. I already kind of mentioned this in the previous slide, but the Manila Galleons was this trading strategy where Spanish ships starting in Mexico would sail to the Philippines. They'd get to the Philippines, offload all this silver and gold they mined out of the New World. Because remember, well, especially silver. China loved silver. So they would mine silver in Mexico and South America, send it to Acapulco, load it onto a ship, sail the ship straight to the Philippines, and in the Philippines, they would trade that silver for porcelain, silk, tea, and spices, and then those ships would sail straight back from the Philippines all the way to Acapulco. And these ships were basically doing one-shot adventures straight from Acapulco all the way to the Philippines, largely without stopping. And I know that many times the ships of these Manila galleons would break apart over these long journeys across the Pacific Ocean. Guys would be starving to death on their journey across the Pacific Ocean. It was rough. But, I mean, if you could just do one of these shiploads full of porcelain, silk, tea, and spices, you'd make tons of money back in Europe. Europeans paid big, big money for Chinese goods. So these ships were worth it in the end economically. And you would have hoped that there could have been some layover spots for the Spanish too. I mean, Hawaii comes to mind. It's this island chain in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It would have been perfect for them. And also, like, sailing all the way down to Acapulco, like latitude, longitude lines, the Spanish are kind of going out of their way to go south. It would have been a lot more intelligent for the Spanish to set up a stopover spot in Hawaii, or to set up a trading post in San Francisco Bay in California. But the Spanish never discovered Hawaii or San Francisco Bay. The Spanish, they didn't really focus too much of their efforts on sea exploration. They focused a lot of their efforts on land exploration in the Americas, hoping there would be another empire to take over, but they never found one. So, yeah, I think this whole thing is really interesting. But yeah, the Manila galleons, they definitely dominated world trade for 250 years. All right, moving on. Okay, and then as far as what was Spain doing in the New World, they created this really racist legal system called the castas system. And the castas system more or less says this: the whiter your skin tone, the more privileges and powers you have in society. Super messed up, by the way. Like, racism, not good. And casta means lineage in Spain, and there were technically 104 racial classifications, okay? They really tried to break up people based on how white they were in so many different ways. But there's really only 4 castas that I have consistently seen in historical documents. And the one that's just really shocking to a lot of people is the laws of this part of the world said if you were a white person born in Spain, you could do anything. You could hold the highest offices. You could be governor. You could take over universities. You could be a general. You could do whatever you want if you're a white person born in Spain. You were called a peninsulare, which is top of the line. But if you were a white person who was born in the New World, you know, let's say both your parents came from Spain and you just came out of your mom in the New World. So you're like a native white person in the Americas. You were actually considered beneath peninsulares, and you could do most things in society, but you would never be allowed to be a governor, a general. You could never operate your own major business. And that really pissed off a lot of these people. And so these white people born in the New World are known as Creoles. And I know that there are many cases where a man and woman would fall in love with each other in the New World. They're both white. They would say, okay, let's go back to Spain, have our baby in Spain, and then return to the New World, just so that baby would be considered a peninsulare. And that was the law back then. It's super duper messed up. Okay, and then below Creoles are mestizos, and mestizos are people of mixed European and Native American blood, and that is the vast majority of Latinos today. If you are a Latino person, you are probably a mestizo. I think 93% of people in Mexico today identify as mestizo. But if you're a mestizo, you couldn't hold any positions of power at all. Like, maybe you could operate a really small business, but you definitely couldn't go to college. Maybe you couldn't even own land. So it's really messed up that the racial aspects of privilege and power were so apparent in the New World all the way from the beginning. And below mestizos are mulattoes. Mulattoes are people who are half European and half African, and they were considered menial free laborers and nothing more. They were given some rights, but even beneath mestizos. Slaves and natives, they were below the casta system entirely, considered less than human being because they had no white blood at all. And I'll definitely argue that this casta system set the precedent for future societies that are going to come to the Americas and be like, oh, racism? That's what we do here. All right. And it's super duper messed up. And the legacies of this system, I'm going to argue, is still very apparent in societies across the Americas to this day. Okay, so here's just a bunch of pictures of the casta system. Here's what I would call some peninsulares. You know, they're from Spain. They're super fancy. They're really white. Here are some Creoles. You know, they're still white people. They're just born in the Americas. This lady is mulatto. She's half white, half black. And then if the dad's European and the mom's a Native American, the kid would be a mestizo. And mestizos are going to be kind of the majority of the population. All right, now let's talk about France's strategy. So France is going to focus on Canada, which will later get taken over by Britain in the later 1700s. But for a couple hundred years, Canada was known as New France, and all kinds of French people moved there, and they'll later be known as the Quebecois. By all accounts, actually, I'm going to argue that the French-Canadian experience, they were the most not racist. They were the most multicultural, most accepting peoples in the New World. Because France had this strategy where it's like, okay, there's a whole lot of Native Americans that live up here, especially by the Great Lakes. We want to incorporate them into our society. So they really did encourage mixed marriages. They gave half-blooded children like all the privileges as white people. So good job in Canada, France. Thumbs up to you. However, though, France also is going to put a whole lot of attention on the island of Haiti, and they're going to turn Haiti into the worst example of slavery in the New World. So they're definitely not going to treat the Haitian people or African slaves with any level of respect at all. So France is sort of a mixed bag here, where they're the best example of niceness in Canada and the worst example of niceness in Haiti. Haiti's going to make France incredibly wealthy. And I'm going to deep dive into Haiti later in history, but know that at this time period, France colonizes Haiti, and for the next 200, 300 years, they're going to turn Haiti into this incredible moneymaker, totally based off the slave trade. All right. Oh, and later in history, France is going to get involved in Northern Africa and Southeast Asia, but that's in kind of Unit 6 of AP World. That comes 100 years later or so. All right, now let's talk about the Netherlands, the Dutch. Oh, I love the Dutch. They're just my favorite people. I had a Dutch foreign exchange student live with me during college. Great dude. High five. So let's talk about the Dutch. So the Dutch really gave all their focus on one place, the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia. The Dutch didn't have any major trading posts. They owned a couple islands in the Caribbean, and then they did set up a trading post at the bottom of Africa, so maybe that was their one little pit stop. But the Dutch were technically controlled by the Spanish for most of this period, so the Dutch couldn't really, do a lot of independent foreign policy. The one thing they definitely could do, though, was they created these corporations that were sort of outside the scope of politics. And these corporations operated like imperial powers. And their biggest company, the most famous of their companies, and the company that has been considered by historians to be the most successful company in human history. This company made more money adjusted for inflation than Apple or Amazon today, which is just impressive. The Dutch company called the VOC, that's how you'd say it in Dutch, and that's what you're always going to see on these historical documents. Like, here's their symbol right here, VOC. But they call it the Dutch East India Company, even though they really didn't do anything in India. They just went to the Spice Islands. Anyway, the VOC was just way, way powerful of a company. It was definitely the most success. If you own stock in VOC, you like quadrupled your money every year. It's ridiculous. And the Dutch, the reason why the VOC was so successful was the Dutch found out that all cinnamon, nutmeg, clover, there's some more, pepper, all these like really valuable spices came out of Indonesia. And so the VOC raised up a bunch of money. They got a bunch of stockholders, a bunch of these rich nobles united together. They built warships. They took over Indonesia. They forced the people to farm these spices for them. They brought them back to Europe, and they sold them with incredible profits. Unbelievable amounts of money were made. I could definitely argue the streets of Amsterdam were built off the backs of Indonesian laborers. I mean, yeah, it's definitely not a nice thing that they did in history, but the Dutch were, and are still today, one of the greatest nations of business in Europe. If someone knows how to make money, probably a Dutch person, okay? Don't mess with them. All right, moving on. Oh, by the way, New Amsterdam. Yeah, for a brief time, the Dutch colonized North America as well, and they found this really awesome harbor area, modern-day New York City, and the Dutch made the first colony in modern-day New York City. They called it New Amsterdam, but eventually the English take them over and they kick them out, and they switch it from being New Amsterdam to New York City. So, more you know. Okay, and yeah, let me just expand more on joint stock companies. I've got this whole simulation game where I'll really try to show you guys what these are all about. But joint stock companies are a big concept during this period. And it's this idea that imperialism and colonialism and this being a maritime power isn't just something that's done at the country level. There were several companies, and the most successful companies are, of course, the VOC that I just mentioned, the British East India Company, they focused on India, and the Virginia Company, which focused on the United States. And these companies were all independent from their countrywide governments. They were sort of like mercenary corporations, okay? Like, imagine if Amazon.com also, like, gave their delivery guys guns, and their delivery guys occasionally, like, showed up at small countries and, like, just stole things from them. So, yeah, you should think of joint stock companies sort of like delivery men / mercenaries that took over parts of planet Earth. Yeah, that's what's up. And then, how do joint stock companies work? Who's sort of in charge of them? Well, if you're a rich person who's got money to spare, all you got to do is invest in these joint stock companies, and every time they make trades or steal stuff, they will share the money with the people who invested in them. So, yeah, pretty hardcore stuff. But over the course of history, especially these three joint stock companies, the really successful ones, they're going to be taken over and incorporated into imperial governments. But they definitely sort of laid the foundations and proved that European weapons could easily control people around the world, and they were kind of the precursor for the age of imperialism, which will be a big theme once we get to the 1800s. All right, moving on. All right, and now the last country to talk about, the United Kingdom, also known as England or Britain. The official name is the United Kingdom, but I'm just telling you, I'm going to make the mistake and say England and Britain a lot too. Whatever term I use, I'm talking about the same country. So the United Kingdom, I'm going to say, was definitely the last European power to get into the maritime empire game. And their big focus was, okay, we just got to build a really big navy. If we can beat anybody in water combat, we can control the whole darn world. And at the beginning of this period, Britain was just still, doing their whole Reformation thing, and they went to war with Spain, and they barely won that war, and they were defining their own religion. But Queen Elizabeth saw the way the waves of the world were changing, and she said, okay, we're going to cut down huge swaths of the forest in England. We're going to build tons of ships. We're going to build big ships. We're going to learn how to make the best cannons, the best guns in Europe, and we're just going to bully everybody else to follow our laws and follow our rules. And also, geographically speaking, I mean, Britain is this island here off the coast of the rest of Europe, and they had a lot of great ports. I mentioned they had a lot of forests to build these ships, so they are sort of the best suited to be kind of the naval power of the world. And that's absolutely something they do achieve by the 1700s. They even have a patriotic song about it called Britannia Ruled the Waves. And they are the world's supreme navy until the year 1945, only to be eclipsed by the United States of America. What's up? So, yeah, you own the waters, you own the world. And I even heard this comparison, which I think is historically defensible, that the United Kingdom, they were the Mongols of the sea. Okay, they had these almost unbeatable ships. They could sail anywhere in the world really fast, and they would just say, you know, follow our rules, give us some of your stuff, or we'll kill you. And that's definitely what they did. Okay, they're going to focus on North America and India, and later in history, Australia, China, and Africa. And later in history, because they're literally all over the dang world, they can't effectively control everywhere. So that overextension will cause the British Empire to collapse in the 1950s. So they keep it going for almost, what is this, like 250 years. It's pretty good. Pretty good, UK. Okay, and yes, this just sort of confirms what I said in the last slide. Britain will be the most offensive nation in world history. Here's this map right here. Every country in blue, Britain has invaded at some point in the last 250 years. It's pretty amazing that Britain's just going to play offense forever. And Britain actually is the worst enemy of the United States. I mean, we went to war with them twice, and they burned down the White House in 1812. If people burn down the White House, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the victory move right there. So pretty hardcore stuff. Okay, and now let me talk about some religious changes happening in Europe during this period. So the Protestant Reformation in Europe definitely created thousands of new versions of Christianity. And as these different versions are sort of setting out their spots in Europe and trying to be like, okay, this is where the Lutherans are, this is where the Calvinists are, this is where the Catholics are, there are a lot of these really tiny versions of Christianity that really didn't have a place to call their own. And they were getting kind of oppressed, and they were like, you got to become a Lutheran or we'll kill you. We don't want to be a Lutheran, let us leave. So a lot of these small Christian groups called up, especially the English king, because he was, started his own version of Protestantism, and they said, hey, can we go to the New World and do our religion there all on our own and have no one bother us? And the English king is like, sure, go ahead. Because these groups viewed themselves as nations, they wanted to make their own states in the New World, just so they could have religious freedom and define themselves as being their own thing. So this really these small religious groups, I know that there was some. I want to say all 13 of the original American colonies had some unique religion to kind of define them at the beginning, and they're going to set the stage for the American colonies. And it also really does show you this historical theme that even though Europe was breaking away from the Catholic faith, these European faiths really tried to push their way into other societies and on other people. And Europe was now becoming a place where diversity of religious thought was becoming illegal. And they wanted to be in this new world to practice their religion on their own. Also this time, witchcraft was a thing. I'll get into that in the fourth part of this lecture series. All right. Okay, 2 more slides to go. So the last concept I really got to talk about is mercantilism. And mercantilism is a huge concept in AP World, and I'm going to cover it in 2 slides, just so I hopefully make it very, very clear to you kids. So mercantilism is this idea that a country needs more land and more natural resources to become economically prosperous. If your country does not have enough raw goods coming in, then your cities won't be able to produce enough stuff to make your country wealthy. So every major European power during this time, all those 5 maritime empires, they all believed in this concept and said we should take over lands in the Americas or in Southeast Asia, and those lands will provide the primary materials for our manufacturing, our secondary economies back in Europe. So the whole thing is, yeah, we're taking over the Americas, but we're not going to build them up. We're not going to make these, like, officially the same as Spain or the same as France. The purpose of the Americas is to provide for Europe. So they really didn't invest too much on building big cities. I mean, yes, there were definitely trade port cities, but the economies of the New World was definitely structured to be largely agricultural, largely primary economies, extracting the resources, because Europe is actually going to process the resources into new stuff. Like some examples I know, I think it was illegal for anyone to make guns in the New World, because even though they were mining iron and they were mining all the necessary materials to make guns, they wanted all the manufacturing to be done back in Europe so that Europe would be the one to sort of make the money off of selling the final product. That's this whole idea of mercantilism. It's really screwed up for the Americas. Yeah, so I think I've definitely covered a lot of that. And the European kings and queens, they're going to make huge profits from all these resources being shipped out of the New World. It's really messed up. Okay, so I'm going to say this whole thing again. If you've already got a good concept of mercantilism, you don't have to write this down, but here I go again. Mercantilism dictates that raw materials come from these colonies around the world, but the products that people are eventually going to buy are designed and built in the home country, giving the home country the most economic advantage. Throughout this entire period, Europe would grow into a manufacturing center of the world, and the demand for fancy goods would increase as European nobility would acquire almost limitless funds from the New World. Europe would soon be the major center of the world economy. They aren't quite there yet. I mean, China and the gunpowder empires are still very much on the world stage, but Europe is rising fast. Way, way fast from what they used to be. All right, and yep, that's the topic for the next video. All right, peace out.